They measured him with a $2 bill, but heaven has a quiet way of weighing a man by the burdens he carried and the kindness he never spent. The lawyer's office in Pine Hollow, Vermont, smelled of lemon polish, wet wool, and old paper that had been handled by too many disappointed hands. Outside the tall window, an early November snow drifted sideways across Main Street, softening the red brick storefronts, the white steeple at the end of town, and the faded American flag above the post office until everything looked like a memory trying not to vanish. Ethan Caldwell sat in the last chair near the radiator, where the heat clicked inside like tired bones. He was 41 years old, broad in the shoulders from years in the Army Corps of Engineers and years after that doing whatever work kept a man fed, but his coat hung a little loose now, an old brown canvas jacket rubbed pale at the cuffs. His hair was dark, cut short out of habit, with a few silver threads at the temples that caught the overhead light when he lowered his head. A day's worth of stubble shadowed his square jaw. His skin was fair, weathered by wind and sun, the kind of white skin that reddened in the cold and carried every season plainly. His eyes were gray-blue, steady but distant, like winter water under thin ice. At his boots lay Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a black saddle, tan legs, strong chest, and watchful amber eyes. The dog rested quietly, but not lazily. Nothing about Ranger was careless. His ears moved toward every cough, every page turn, every whisper from the Caldwell family gathered closer to the lawyer's polished desk, as if he had learned long ago that the smallest sounds often carried the truest warnings. Ethan's sister, Marla, wore a cream coat with gold buttons and kept smoothing one gloved hand over the pearl necklace at her throat. His cousin Brent leaned back as though the room belonged to him already. The younger relatives checked their phones, pretending not to wait for money. They had not seen Ethan much since he came home from overseas, except at holidays where he washed dishes without being asked, fixed a loose porch step before anyone noticed, and left before conversation could circle toward what he had done with his life. To them, he was the quiet one, the unlucky one, the man who had served his country and somehow returned without the easy shape of success. The lawyer, Mr. Halvorson, adjusted his glasses and read from Walter Caldwell's will in a voice that tried to stay neutral. Lake acreage went to Marla. Investment accounts went into trusts. The old farmhouse outside town went to Brent. Silverware, framed maps, antique rifles locked behind glass, savings bonds, jewelry, all of it moved around the room like warm bread passed to everyone except the man by the radiator. Ethan kept one hand resting lightly on Ranger's neck, feeling the calm pulse beneath the thick fur. He had learned in veteran life that silence could be armor, and he wore it now without bitterness, though something in his chest tightened each time a name was called and gratitude bloomed on someone else's face. Then Mr. Halvorson paused. He looked over the top of the will, not at the family, but at Ethan. For my nephew Ethan Caldwell, Walter had written, I leave the Blackwater Creek log cabin, with all remaining contents therein, and one sealed envelope marked with his name. The room went still for half a breath, then loosened into small sounds. A chair creaked. Someone exhaled through a smile. Brent covered his mouth, but not well enough. Marla's eyes flicked toward Ethan with a softness too thin to be mercy. The cabin, everyone in Pine Hollow knew, was a sagging stack of old timber tucked 5 miles beyond the paved road, where the creek ran black under hemlock roots and the cell signal disappeared. Walter had lived there alone after his wife passed, repairing clocks, feeding stray cats, and writing letters nobody understood. It was not an inheritance. It was a punchline with a roof. Mr. Halvorson slid the envelope across the desk. Ethan stood, crossed the room, and took it with both hands the way he had once accepted folded flags for men whose names he still remembered. The paper was yellowed, the flap sealed with tape gone brittle at the edges. His name had been written in Walter's shaky blue ink, Ethan, who still listens. He opened it carefully. Inside was a $2 bill, old but uncreased, wrapped in a thin piece of wax paper. Beneath it lay a note no bigger than a church bulletin. Spend it only when you understand what it bought. For the first time that morning, Ranger lifted his head fully. His ears sharpened forward. His amber eyes fixed on the $2 bill as if it had made a sound only he could hear. Brent gave a low chuckle from behind Ethan. $2 in a shack, he said, not loudly, but loudly enough. Sounds about right. No one corrected him. The words floated in the polished office, small and ugly, then settled somewhere near Ethan's boots. Ethan did not turn around. He looked at the bill, at the green ink, at Thomas Jefferson's calm face, at the serial number marching across the paper like coordinates. His thumb brushed the edge of the wax paper, and for a moment the office disappeared. He was no longer under fluorescent lights in Vermont, but standing years ago in a dusty motor pool before dawn, watching a young private tuck a $2 bill into the band of his helmet and grin about breakfast back home in Ohio. $2 can still buy a promise, the kid had said. Ethan had laughed then because men laugh at small hopes when large fears stand nearby. Now, in Walter's office, the memory came back quiet as snowfall. Ranger rose to his feet. The dog stepped closer, pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg, and gave one soft breath through his nose. Not a bark. Not a command. A reminder. Ethan folded the note, returned the bill to its wax paper, and slipped both into the inside pocket of his jacket. When he finally looked at his family, his expression had not hardened. That was what unsettled them most. There was no anger to enjoy, no shame to measure, no plea for a kinder portion. Only a tired calm, and something deeper beneath it, like a coal protected under ash. "Thank you," he said to the lawyer. His voice was low, roughened by cold air and years of saying less than he felt. The meeting ended in the scrape of chairs and the rustle of expensive coats. Outside, snow had begun to gather along the curb, turning the tire tracks white. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk with Ranger beside him, the two of them reflected in the dark glass of the office window, a veteran with an old jacket, a German shepherd with soldier-still posture, and a sealed fate no one else wanted. Across the street, the diner sign glowed red through the storm, and beyond the town limits, somewhere under the pines, Blackwater Creek moved beneath a skin of ice. Ethan looked north, toward the road that led to the cabin. Ranger looked the same way before Ethan did. The dog's ears tilted, listening past the church bell, past the idling trucks, past the soft laughter of relatives behind them. Then he gave two quiet taps of his paw against the snowy sidewalk. Ethan felt the $2 bill inside his coat, light as paper, heavy as a calling. He had been overlooked by his family, but not, it seemed, by the old man who had known the worth of forgotten things. The road north out of Pine Hollow narrowed after the last gas station, slipping past the diner, the white church, and the row of clapboard houses where porch lights glowed early against the snow. Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel of his old Ford pickup, the heater rattling softly beneath the dash, the $2 bill resting inside his jacket like a small, impossible weight. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, upright and watchful, his black saddle and tan shoulders edged with the gray light of late afternoon. Every few miles, the German shepherd lifted his nose toward the cracked window, taking in the scent of wet pine, chimney smoke, road salt, and the deep cold coming down from the Green Mountains. Pine Hollow faded behind them one storefront at a time, and with it faded the voices from the lawyer's office, though not completely. Brent's quiet laugh still had a way of traveling with Ethan, finding space between the hum of the tires and the whisper of snow against the windshield. $2 and a shack. Ethan did not resent the words as much as he should have. A man who had lived through enough silence learned that some people spoke only to prove the emptiness in themselves. Still, there were things a family could say that settled under the ribs and stayed there. He glanced at Ranger, whose amber eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "You heard it too, did you, boy?" Ethan said. Ranger did not move, but one ear turned toward him. That was answer enough. The paved road ended 3 miles beyond town, where a green sign marked Blackwater Creek Road in white reflective letters scratched by weather. The truck rolled onto gravel and then hard-packed dirt, climbing through hemlock and maple woods where the branches bowed under thin snow. The forest seemed older here, less interested in human trouble. Stone walls appeared and vanished beside the road, remnants of farms abandoned long before Ethan was born. A rusted mailbox leaned at the bend with the name Caldwell barely visible beneath flaking paint. Ethan slowed. Beyond it, a narrow driveway disappeared between two pines, their trunks dark with moisture, their needles shining like black-green glass. Ranger stood before the truck fully stopped. His nails clicked against the vinyl seat. Ethan cut the engine, and the silence rushed in so completely that he heard the tick of cooling metal beneath the hood and the distant water moving under ice. For a moment he stayed there, looking through the windshield at the cabin. It sat in a small clearing above the creek, made of old logs darkened by decades of rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly at the left corner. The chimney leaned but had not fallen. A porch ran along the front, its rail bowed outward like a tired arm. One shutter hung crooked, tapping softly each time the wind passed. It was not beautiful in the way magazines taught people to understand beauty. It was weathered, stubborn, plain, and somehow still standing. Ethan felt an unexpected ache in his chest. Walter had lived here alone for 12 years, after Aunt Ruth died and the family stopped inviting him to Sunday meals because he smelled of wood smoke and spoke too honestly. Ethan remembered visiting once as a teenager. Walter had shown him how to split kindling with patience instead of force, how to listen for a dry log by the sound it made when tapped, how to mend a thing before deciding it was finished. Back then, Ethan had thought the old man was teaching him chores. Now he wondered whether Walter had been teaching him how to survive being underestimated. Ranger jumped down first, landing lightly in the snow. He did not run. He moved slowly toward the porch, nose close to the ground, following a path only he could read. Ethan opened the driver's door and stepped into the cold. His boots sank an inch into the powder. The air smelled of cedar, iron-rich water, and old leaves pressed under frost. He pulled his canvas jacket tighter and took a duffel from behind the seat, though he had no plan beyond seeing what Walter had left behind. The porch boards complained under his weight, but they held. Ranger paused at the front door, sniffed along the threshold, then looked back at Ethan with a seriousness that made the world feel smaller. The key from the lawyer fit after a little effort. The lock turned with a dry click. Inside, the cabin held the kind of cold that belonged to places left alone too long. Dust lay thin over a pine table, 2 ladder-backed chairs, a black iron stove, and shelves lined with coffee tins, mason jars, fishing lures, and small clocks in various states of repair. A red flannel shirt hung from a peg beside the door, faded at the shoulders. A chipped enamel mug rested upside down near the sink. On the mantel above the stone fireplace stood a photograph of Walter and Ruth when they were young, both smiling beside the creek, sunlight caught in her hair and his hand resting shyly near hers. Ethan removed his hat without thinking. Ranger walked the room in a careful circle. His paws left dark prints in the dust. He sniffed the stove, the table legs, the braided rug near the hearth, then stopped at the far corner where the floorboards met the stone fireplace. His body changed all at once. The easy movement left him. His ears rose. His tail lowered. Ethan noticed. "What is it?" Ranger did not bark. He leaned forward and breathed along the seam between wood and stone. Ethan crossed the room, each step stirring the scent of old pine. The fireplace had been built from river rock, gray and brown stones fitted by hand. On the second row from the bottom, one stone looked slightly smoother than the others, as if someone had touched it many times. Ethan crouched, but before he reached for it, Ranger turned away from the fireplace and moved to the table. The dog placed one paw on the edge of the braided rug beneath it and scratched twice, softly, deliberately. Ethan's hand went to the inside pocket of his jacket. He drew out the wax paper packet and unfolded it on the table. The $2 bill looked strangely clean in the dim room, its green ink holding more life than the cabin around it. He set it beside Walter's note. "Spend it only when you understand what it bought." Outside, the wind shifted, moving around the logs with a low, almost musical hum. Ranger stood over the rug, waiting. Ethan pulled the table aside. The legs scraped the floor with a tired groan. He rolled back the braided rug and found a rectangle in the dust where the colors of the wood were less faded. At first he saw only boards. Then the late light from the window touched the floor at an angle, and a mark appeared near one nailhead, a tiny carved pine tree, no bigger than a thumbnail, with the number 2 beneath it. Ethan stopped breathing for a second. He brought the bill closer, lowering it over the mark without knowing why. The length of the bill matched a shallow outline worn into the floor, an outline so faint it would have vanished to anyone who had not been guided to it. Ranger gave one low breath, steady and sure. Ethan looked from the bill to the fireplace, from the fireplace to the floor, and felt the cabin change around him. It no longer seemed abandoned. It seemed patient. As twilight gathered blue in the windows, Ethan understood that Walter had not left him a joke. He had left him a question, and somehow Ranger had already begun to answer it. The first evening inside the cabin did not arrive all at once. it gathered slowly in the corners, deepening the lines between the logs, turning the window panes from gray to blue to black, until Ethan could see his own reflection hovering over the room like a man standing outside his own life. He lit the old kerosene lamp on the table after checking the wick, then opened the iron stove and found kindling stacked neatly inside, dry and ready, as if Walter had prepared it that morning instead of months ago. The match flared gold against Ethan's fair, weathered hand, and for a brief second the tiny flame made the $2 bill shine on the table with an importance that felt almost unreasonable. Ranger lay near the braided rug, but his body remained alert, his black saddle dark against the pine floor, his tan legs folded beneath him, his amber eyes following every move Ethan made. Outside, Blackwater Creek whispered under its thin skin of ice, a quiet running sound that seemed to pass beneath the cabin and continue somewhere deeper than the land itself. Ethan fed the stove, watched the first orange tongues of fire catch, and let the warmth begin its careful work. The room softened by degrees. The mason jars on the shelf glowed amber. The old clocks above Walter's workbench threw small shadows across the wall. Dust lifted in the lamplight and drifted like slow snow. Ethan took off his jacket and hung it beside Walter's red flannel shirt, then stood there looking at the two garments side by side, one worn by a soldier who had come home feeling unfinished, the other by an old man who had hidden his tenderness beneath stubborn habits and rough jokes. He wondered how many evenings Walter had spent in this room with no one but the fire for company. He wondered whether loneliness sounded different when a person chose it. Ranger rose suddenly and crossed to the fireplace again. This time he pressed his nose to the smoother stone in the second row, then looked back. Ethan crouched beside him with the lamp in one hand. The stone did not look loose at first. It sat flush among the river rocks, gray-brown and ordinary, its surface rubbed faintly lighter than the others. Ethan touched it with 2 fingers. Cold. Solid. Yet something in the shape of it bothered him, not the face of the stone but the thin dark line around it, too even to be natural. He pressed once. Nothing happened. Ranger gave 2 soft taps on the floor with his paw. Ethan looked down at the carved pine tree and the small number 2, then back at the $2 bill resting on the table. A memory moved through him, not sharp, not painful, simply present. Walter at this same fireplace years earlier, telling a 16-year-old Ethan that every good structure needed one hidden strength no one applauded. A beam, a brace, a hand-turned peg buried behind the wall. People love what they can see, Walter had said, but what holds them up is usually covered over. Ethan had not understood then. Now, with the stove breathing warmth into the little room and Ranger watching him with patient certainty, the words returned with the weight of instruction. Ethan brought the bill from the table and studied it under the lamp. On the back, beneath the image of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Walter had made a mark so faint it looked like a stain, a tiny dot under one figure, then another dot near the edge, 2 points that aligned when Ethan folded the bill lengthwise. He did not like folding old money, but the wax paper had protected it too carefully for this to be accidental. When the corners met, the serial number broke into 2 groups. The first was 2 digits. The second was a longer string that looked, suddenly, less like a number and more like a measurement. Ethan whispered it aloud, slowly, because voiceover words in an empty cabin seemed to make the truth more real. 2 feet, 7 inches. Ranger's ears rose. Ethan turned back to the fireplace. From the carved mark in the floor, he measured with the tape he found in Walter's workbench drawer, 2 feet, 7 inches to the smoother stone. His pulse changed, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the language Walter knew Ethan would understand. Structures. Measurements. Patience. Hidden load-bearing truths. Ethan pressed the stone again, this time not at the center but near the lower right edge. It shifted inward with a soft wooden click from behind the wall. The sound was so small it might have been missed beneath a cough or a passing truck, but in the quiet cabin it seemed to ring through the logs. Ranger stepped closer, calm but bright-eyed. A narrow panel beside the hearth eased outward half an inch, releasing a breath of cool air that smelled of cedar, old paper, and earth after rain. Ethan sat back on his heels. The fire cracked gently in the stove behind him. He thought of the lawyer's office, the polished desk, the family waiting for valuable things with hungry smiles. He thought of Brent laughing at the cabin, at the $2, at him. Then he thought of Walter writing his name on the envelope, Ethan, who still listens. The panel opened only a few inches before catching on something inside. Ethan could see darkness beyond it, and at the edge of that darkness, the corner of a small metal box. Not a treasure chest. Not something grand. Just a plain, blackened tin box tucked carefully into a space built between stone and timber. He reached in and drew it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Ranger sat beside him, his shoulder touching Ethan's arm, grounding him the way the dog had done in crowded stores, on restless nights, and in all the ordinary American places where a veteran could look fine on the outside and still be searching for a quiet place to stand. The lid had no lock. Only a strip of cloth tied around it, faded blue, the color of an old work shirt. Ethan untied it and lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters, a brass key darkened by age, a Polaroid photograph of Walter standing in front of the cabin with 3 men Ethan did not recognize, and a folded map of Pine Hollow marked with small pine trees in blue ink. Beneath the map was another note. Ethan unfolded it carefully, holding it near the lamp. Walter's handwriting trembled more here, as if written late at night or near the end of something. If you found this, the dog was right about you too. Ethan looked down at Ranger, whose amber eyes reflected the fire. A smile touched Ethan's face, small and surprised, the first honest one since morning. He read on. The $2 was never the gift. It was the receipt. Find Clara Whitcomb at the diner. She remembers what the town forgot. For a long moment, Ethan did not move. Beyond the walls, Blackwater Creek kept speaking under the ice. The cabin was no longer a poor inheritance with a sagging roof. It had become a doorway into a promise, and somewhere in town, under the neon glow of an old diner, there was a woman who knew why Walter had hidden it from everyone except the one man they had all overlooked. Morning came to Blackwater Creek with a pale gold edge, touching the tops of the hemlocks before it reached the cabin windows. Ethan had slept only a few hours on the old couch beneath a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, but the sleep had been deeper than he expected, held by the stove's fading warmth and Ranger's steady breathing near the door. When he opened his eyes, the cabin was blue with dawn. The tin box sat on the table where he had left it, its letters, brass key, Polaroid photograph, folded map, and Walter's note arranged with a carefulness that made the little room feel less like shelter and more like testimony. Ranger was already awake, sitting upright with his black saddle catching the first light, tan paws planted squarely on the pine floor, amber eyes turned toward Ethan as if the dog had been waiting for him to remember the next step. Ethan warmed coffee in an old enamel pot, drank it black, and read Walter's note again while the creek murmured beneath the ice outside. Find Clara Whitcomb at the diner. She remembers what the town forgot. The sentence did not explain anything, yet it had the weight of a road sign in bad weather. By 7 o'clock, Ethan had locked the cabin, pocketed the $2 bill, the brass key, and one folded letter, then guided the Ford pickup back down the narrow driveway toward Pine Hollow. Ranger rode beside him with the window cracked 2 inches, nose lifted into the cold air. The forest passed in long bands of white and green. Snow fell from branches in soft puffs as the truck moved beneath them. Ethan kept thinking about the Polaroid, Walter Younger, standing before the cabin with 3 men in work jackets, all of them smiling with the guarded gratitude of people who had survived something and did not need to name it. On the back, in Walter's hand, were 4 words, First Winter, First Promise. Pine Hollow looked different in daylight after the cabin. The town seemed almost too tidy, as if every storefront had agreed to keep quiet about what lay beyond the paved road. The diner sat across from the post office, a low building with chrome trim, red vinyl booths, and a sign that read Millie's in cursive letters faded by decades of sun. A small American flag stood in a coffee can near the entrance, stiff with frost. Ethan parked beside a pickup with a plow blade and sat for a moment before going in. He had spent years learning how to enter unfamiliar rooms without asking them to welcome him. Veteran life after service had taught him that not every door was locked, but some still made a man hesitate. Ranger looked at him, then gently touched his nose to Ethan's sleeve. Ethan breathed once, opened the door, and stepped into the smell of pancakes, bacon, burnt coffee, and maple syrup. A bell above the diner door rang softly. Conversations lowered, not dramatically, just enough for the town to notice the man they had all heard about by now, Walter Caldwell's nephew, the one who had inherited the cabin no one wanted. Ranger walked at Ethan's left side, calm and disciplined, his German Shepherd posture drawing admiring glances from two older men at the counter. A waitress with a pencil behind her ear nodded toward the back booth. "She is expecting you," she said, as if that explained everything. In the last booth by the window sat Clara Whitcomb. She was 82 years old, small but straight-backed, with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a knitted blue cap and hands folded around a mug of tea. Her face carried the fine lines of a person who had laughed often but forgotten none of the reasons she had cried. A green cardigan rested over her shoulders. Beside her plate lay a leather checkbook cover so worn at the corners it looked like something rescued from a drawer of old burdens. Her eyes moved first to Ranger, then to Ethan, then to the pocket of his jacket where the bill was hidden. "You have Walter's look when you are trying not to ask for help," she said. Ethan paused. "I did not know he had a look for that." Clara smiled without showing her teeth. "All decent men do." They sat across from her, Ranger settling under the table with his head near Ethan's boots. The waitress brought coffee without being asked. For a while, Clara said nothing. She watched the snow pass the window and the church steeple rise beyond it, white against a sky the color of pewter. Then Ethan placed the $2 bill on the table, still inside its wax paper. Clara's hand trembled when she saw it. Not from fear, but recognition. She touched the edge of the wax paper with one finger, as gently as if greeting an old friend. "I wondered if he kept it," she whispered. Ethan leaned forward. "What did it buy?" Clara closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, the diner noise seemed to fall away. "A beginning," she said. "That is what it bought." She told him Walter had not always been the strange old man at Blackwater Creek. In the years after Vietnam, and later during the long decades when younger veterans returned from other places with the same faraway silence, Walter became the person men found when they could not sleep indoors, could not keep a job, or could not explain to their families why coming home did not feel like arriving. He fixed engines with them. He paid deposits on apartments. He bought groceries and called it a loan, then forgot to collect. Clara had kept books for the town credit union back then, and she had seen Walter come in with mud on his boots and cash folded in envelopes, always asking that no one make a fuss. The $2 came from a young service member passing through Pine Hollow on a winter morning, she said. He gave it to Walter after Walter bought him breakfast right here in this booth. Said it was all he had to repay him. Walter framed it in his heart, not on a wall. Ethan looked down at the bill, its green ink softened by age. Clara continued, her voice lower now, warmer and heavier. Walter took the $2 and opened an account. People laughed at him. Some said charity was fine for churches and Christmas drives, but not for men too proud to stand in line. Walter ignored them. He added $5, then $20, then whatever he earned repairing tractors and clocks. Other people added quietly. Widows. Farmers. A schoolteacher. One sheriff. Over time, it became something larger than money. Land near the creek. A cabin repaired again and again. A ledger of names. A place for men to stay until they could breathe without feeling ashamed of needing air. Ethan felt the words move through him slowly. This was not treasure in the way greedy people imagine treasure. It was breakfast bought on a cold morning, rent paid before eviction, a furnace repaired in January, a veteran given work without being asked to explain every scar inside him. Clara reached into her checkbook cover and drew out a small photograph. Walter stood outside the diner decades earlier with the same three men from the Polaroid. This time, Clara was in the picture too, younger, smiling shyly beside the window. "We called it the $2 Foundation," she said. Unofficially. Quietly. Then the records disappeared after the old municipal building flood. Walter stopped trusting desks and file cabinets. He started hiding proof where only the right person would care enough to look. Ethan thought of the map marked with pine trees. The brass key. The panel behind the fireplace. Ranger lifted his head under the table, ears suddenly forward, eyes fixed on Clara's leather cover. Clara noticed and gave a soft laugh. "Your dog has Walter's sense of timing." She opened the back pocket and removed a small envelope, brittle with age. On it was written one line in blue ink, "For the nephew with the dog, if he comes asking before the family does." Ethan held the envelope, and for the first time since the will was read, his throat tightened. Through the diner window, the morning light broke across Main Street, touching the flag, the snow, the old red booths, and Ranger's watchful face beneath the table. Clara folded her hands again and looked at Ethan not with pity, but with trust. "Go back to the cabin," she said. "The map will show you the first marker, but the bill will show you why it matters. Walter was not hiding riches from your family, Mr. Caldwell. He was protecting a promise from anyone who would spend it without understanding its cost." The envelope from Clara Whitcomb rested on the passenger seat between Ethan and Ranger as the Ford pickup climbed back toward Blackwater Creek, its paper trembling slightly with every rut in the frozen road. Ethan had not opened it inside the diner. Something about Clara's hands, the softened look in her eyes, and the way she had said Walter was protecting a promise made the envelope feel less like information and more like a prayer that deserved quiet. Pine Hollow slipped behind them beneath a thin veil of sunlit snow. The church bell struck noon as they passed the last row of houses, and the sound followed them into the woods, fading among the hemlocks until only the tires on gravel and Ranger's steady breathing remained. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other near the pocket where the $2 bill lay inside its wax paper. He thought about the service member who had once given it to Walter after breakfast in that red booth, a small repayment offered by someone who had almost nothing except gratitude. In all the years Ethan had spent around military bases, construction yards, veterans' halls, and quiet county offices where men filled out forms they did not want to need, he had learned that dignity often lived in the smallest gestures. A cup of coffee paid for without announcement. A ride offered before pride could refuse it. A dog leaning against a shaking knee under a table. When the cabin appeared through the trees, it looked different from the day before. The roof still sagged, the porch still bowed, and the shutters still wore their weathered gray, but the place no longer seemed abandoned. It seemed chosen. Ranger jumped down as soon as Ethan opened the door and moved straight to the porch, nose low, tail steady. Ethan followed with the tin box tucked under his arm and Clara's envelope in his hand. Inside, the cabin had held the morning cold, but sunlight now fell through the eastern window in a clean rectangle, touching the table, the stove, the folded map, and the brass key. Ethan laid everything out as carefully as a man setting tools before repair. The map of Pine Hollow was older than any road atlas he had seen, hand-drawn on thick paper yellowed at the creases. Small pine trees marked several places around Blackwater Creek, the town cemetery, the diner, and a patch of land beyond the old railbed. One symbol had been circled twice in blue ink, the cabin itself. Ethan opened Clara's envelope last. Inside was a single index card and a small black and white photograph, its edges worn soft. The photograph showed Walter standing beside a wooden sign that read "Welcome Home Workshop," though the letters were unfinished. Around him stood men of different ages, some with work gloves, one with a cane, one holding the leash of a German shepherd not unlike Ranger. Behind them was the cabin, younger than, with straight rails and fresh chinking between the logs. On the card, Clara had written in careful script, "The first marker is not under the floor. It is where the cold air becomes warm without a fire." Ethan read it twice. Ranger was already moving. The German shepherd crossed the room toward the fireplace, paused, then turned away from it and went to the back wall near the old workbench. There, below a row of rusted hand tools, he sniffed along the logs, stopped at a narrow gap between two boards, and released a low, certain breath. Ethan brought the kerosene lamp closer, though it was daytime, and placed his palm near the gap. At first he felt only cold wood. Then, after a few seconds, a faint thread of warmer air touched his skin. It was subtle, impossible to notice unless a person was still enough to listen with the body. Ethan knelt, studying the wall. The boards looked original, but one peg set slightly higher than the others. He pressed it. Nothing. He turned it gently. This time it moved with a quiet click. A section of the workbench eased forward less than an inch, revealing a seam hidden behind the back legs. Ranger sat down, amber eyes bright in the dusty light. Ethan smiled faintly. "Walter," he whispered, "you old engineer." He pulled the workbench forward with care. Behind it was a narrow wooden panel, not a door exactly, but a fitted cover built into the wall. The brass key from the tin box slid into a small dark slot near the bottom. When Ethan turned it, the panel loosened, releasing the scent of cedar shavings, dry earth, and paper kept safe from dampness. Beyond the panel was not a room, but a crawlspace, perhaps 3 feet high, running beneath the back half of the cabin. Ethan took the flashlight from his duffel and shone it inside. The beam found stone supports, old wiring, and a row of sealed metal canisters arranged with military neatness along a wooden shelf. Each canister bore a number and a tiny blue pine tree. Ranger lowered himself first, moving carefully into the space as if he had done it in dreams. Ethan followed on one knee and one hand, the boards above him creaking softly. The crawlspace was cool but not freezing. Somewhere beneath it, water moved through a hidden channel, and a thin warmth rose from the earth, steady and natural. At the far end, Ranger stopped before the second canister. Not the first. The second. Ethan laughed under his breath, because by now the number felt like Walter's hand resting on his shoulder. He brushed dust from the lid and opened the clasp. Inside were ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, a bundle of savings certificates, and letters from men who had stayed at the cabin over the decades. Ethan unfolded one. "Dear Mr. Caldwell," it began, "I slept through the night for the first time since coming home." Another said, "You gave me work before I remembered I was useful." Another, written in a shaky hand, said simply, "The dog knew I was sad before I did." Ethan sat back in the low space, the flashlight beam trembling slightly against the old stone. He had expected, somewhere in the hidden corner of his mind, to find proof of money. What he found first was proof of mercy. Ranger moved closer until his shoulder pressed against Ethan's arm. For a long moment, man and dog stayed beneath the cabin while dust drifted through the light like golden ash. Above them stood the world that had laughed at $2 in old wood. Beneath it, carefully protected from weather and greed, were names, promises, small acts of American kindness, and the beginning of a legacy that had been waiting for someone who knew that being useful could save a life. By the time Ethan carried the second canister up from the crawlspace, afternoon had settled over the cabin in a honey-colored hush, and the low winter sun lay across the floorboards like a blessing too quiet to announce itself. Ranger climbed out after him, dust on his black saddle and tan legs, his amber eyes still alert but calmer now, as if the German shepherd understood that the first door had opened and the cabin had trusted them enough to reveal its heartbeat. Ethan set the canister on Walter's workbench beside the tin box, the folded map, Clara Whitcomb's photograph, the brass key, and the $2 bill protected in wax paper. For a while, he did not open anything else. He stood in the center of the room with his sleeves rolled to his forearms, fair skin reddened slightly from the cold, dark hair loosened from the habit of running his hand through it, and listened to the stove, the creak, the boards, the breathing of the dog who had led him here. There were moments in veteran stories when the world did not change with a shout. It changed with a ledger laid flat on a pine table, with a name written in careful ink, with a man realizing that the life he thought had been reduced to leftovers had been entrusted with something sacred. Ethan opened the first ledger. The pages smelled of oilcloth and age, but the handwriting remained clear. Walter had recorded every dollar that entered the quiet fund, every repair made to the cabin, every person who stayed there, every job found, every loan forgiven. Not all names were complete. Some entries used initials. Some used only descriptions: Marine, age 26, needed boots and 2 weeks of sleep. Army nurse, passing through, asked for no help, accepted soup. Widower with service dog, stayed until spring thaw. Ethan read slowly, his thumb moving down the columns. $5 for bus fare. $12 for medicine. $30 for furnace parts. $45 for work gloves and a used coat. Small numbers, ordinary numbers, the kind people stepped over in bank statements, yet here they felt like stones in a foundation. Ranger lay beneath the table with his chin on his paws, watching Ethan through the warm shadows. Beneath the ledger was a packet of bank documents, land deeds, and old certificates tied with cotton string. Ethan unfolded the first deed and saw Blackwater Creek printed in faded type. The second described 2 acres behind the cabin. The third, 5 more near the old rail bed. Another listed a narrow parcel by the diner. Each paper bore Walter's signature, sometimes steadier, sometimes weaker, but always there. Ethan spread the documents across the table until the cabin seemed to hold an entire hidden map of Pine Hollow. Walter had not been poor in the way people thought. He had been quiet. There was a difference, and Ethan felt ashamed that even he had not understood it. As the light faded, he found a sealed envelope tucked into the back of the ledger. On the front, Walter had written, "For Ethan, if he finds the second marker before dark." The old man had known him too well. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in blue ink on lined paper. "Nephew," it began, "if you are reading this, Ranger has done what people rarely do. He paid attention without judging." Ethan glanced down at the dog, and Ranger's tail moved once against the floor. Walter's letter continued. "The family will see the cabin and think I gave you the least. That is because they still believe worth is measured by what can be sold quickly. I gave you the thing that cannot be sold without being betrayed. I gave you the place where men remembered they were more than what they lost." Ethan swallowed and kept reading. "The money is real. The land is real. The accounts are real. But if you chase those first, you will miss the door that matters. The third marker is under the creek stone where Ruth planted the white pine. Use the brass key only after you understand why she planted it." Ethan lowered the letter. "Ruth." He looked toward the photograph on the mantel, Walter's wife standing by Blackwater Creek with sunlight in her hair. He had been so focused on Walter's clues that he had nearly forgotten the cabin had once held two lives, two sets of hands, two kinds of faith. Outside, the creek moved under ice with a sound like glass being gently tuned. Ranger stood before Ethan did. The dog went to the door and waited. The sky beyond the window had turned lavender. Ethan put on his canvas jacket, tucked the letter and brass key into his pocket, and lifted the kerosene lantern from the table. The cold met them on the porch, clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and frozen water. They followed a narrow path behind the cabin, past a woodpile, past a rusted rain barrel, down toward the creek where stones wore caps of snow. The white pine stood on the bank, smaller than the old hemlocks but strong, its needles silvered by frost. At its base lay a flat creek stone, half buried, pale against the dark earth. Ethan knelt and brushed away the snow with his bare hand. The stone had been carved with two initials, W and R, Walter and Ruth. Between the letters was the same tiny pine tree symbol. Ranger stood beside the trunk, nose lifted, his ears forward, listening not to danger but to memory. Ethan slid his fingers under the stone and lifted. Beneath it was a small copper plate set into the ground, greened by time, with a keyhole at the center. He took out the brass key. For a moment he hesitated. The family had wanted valuable things. The town had forgotten generous things. Walter had hidden both under simple things. Ethan turned the key. Somewhere beneath the creek bank, a soft mechanical sound answered, deep and slow, like a breath released after many winters. Across the narrow water, a section of moss-covered earth shifted open at the base of the hill, revealing not darkness, but the faintest warm glow from below. Ranger did not bark. He stepped closer to Ethan and leaned against him, steady as a promise. Ethan looked back at the cabin, its windows golden in the dusk, smoke rising from the chimney into the Vermont sky. Then he looked at the opening beneath the hill, and understood that the crawlspace had only been the first chapter. Walter and Ruth had built something larger than a hiding place. They had built a sanctuary beneath the roots, and the path to it had been guarded not by wealth, but by remembrance, patience, and the kind of love that keeps working long after the world stops watching. Ethan stood at the creek bank with the brass key still warm in his palm, watching the hidden opening breathe a dim amber light into the evening snow. The entrance had appeared so gently that it seemed less like a machine and more like the earth remembering a promise. Moss loosened from a curved wooden frame set into the hillside, and beneath it a narrow passage sloped downward, lined with stone that had been fitted by patient hands. The glow came from somewhere deeper inside, soft and steady, not electric in the harsh way of office lights, but golden like lanterns seen through old glass. Behind him, the cabin windows shone through the trees, small squares of firelight against the blue Vermont dusk. Ahead of him, below the roots of Walter and Ruth's white pine, waited the thing they had protected through weather, age, and silence. Ranger stepped first to the threshold, his black saddle dusted with snow, tan legs firm, amber eyes reflecting the warm light. He sniffed once, then looked back at Ethan with the calm certainty of a guide who had never needed a map. Ethan lowered the lantern and entered behind him. The passage was just high enough for him to walk with his shoulders slightly bent. He could feel the hill above him, the old weight of soil, roots, stone, and winter. The walls held the scent of cedar oil, dry leaves, and mineral water. Every few feet, small vents had been carved into the stone, allowing fresh air to move through with a faint whisper. Walter had not improvised this place. He had engineered it with care, the way a man builds something meant to outlast him but not announce itself. Ethan's boots touched wooden planks laid over packed earth, each board still solid beneath his weight. Ranger moved ahead without hesitation, his nails clicking in a slow rhythm that echoed softly down the passage. After 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a chamber larger than Ethan expected, and he stopped at the edge of it, unable to speak. Beneath the hill was a room shaped like a chapel and a workshop at the same time. Stone walls curved inward, reinforced with beams of dark timber. A long table stood in the center, polished by use. Shelves lined one side, filled with labeled boxes, binders, mason jars of nails, folded blankets, work gloves, flashlights, canned food, first aid kits, and dog bowls stacked neatly beside leashes and old leather collars. On the far wall hung an American flag, not new, not decorative, but clean and carefully folded at the edges, lit from below by 2 shaded lamps. Beside it was a wooden sign carved by hand, "Welcome home, no explanation needed." Ethan felt the words enter him before he fully understood them. He had spent years around veterans who could explain engines, bridges, weather, and routes across dangerous terrain, but could not explain why a grocery store aisle made the heart race, why fireworks made sleep leave for 3 nights, why a friendly question could feel heavier than a rucksack. No explanation needed. Walter and Ruth had written a whole philosophy in 4 plain words. Ranger walked to a corner where a thick wool blanket lay beside an old German Shepherd photograph in a simple frame. The dog in the picture was black and tan, older around the muzzle, with the same noble stillness Ranger carried. Beneath the frame, a small brass plate read, "Samson, first to know who needed the door opened." Ethan crouched beside Ranger and touched the edge of the blanket. It was clean, folded, and waiting, as if the last visitor had just stepped outside for air. On the table lay another ledger, this one newer than the others, with a sealed packet resting on top. Ethan opened the ledger and found pages of names, dates, and notes written by Walter and sometimes by Ruth. The entries were not records of charity in the proud sense. They were records of restoration. June 5, 1987, fixed truck transmission with Daniel M. Paid him for the work so he would remember he still had a trade. February 12, 1996, Ruth made soup for Alan and his daughter, gave them the south room for 3 nights, no questions. September 21, 2004, helped Maria file benefit papers, Ranger like dog stayed by her chair, good sign. May 8, 2012, bought lumber for ramp, told him it was leftover wood so he would accept it. Ethan read until the letters blurred slightly. The sanctuary was not a bunker for money. It was an underground mercy, hidden beneath a cabin the family considered worthless because the most valuable things inside it had never been meant for display. At the far end of the chamber, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward a second doorway, smaller and half concealed behind a hanging canvas tarp. Ethan crossed the room, drawing the tarp aside. Beyond it was a narrow office, warmer than the main chamber, with a roll-top desk, a banker's lamp, a wall of file cabinets, and a safe built into the stone. The safe door was not locked. On it, Walter had taped a final note in a clear plastic sleeve. Ethan recognized the handwriting at once. "Nephew," it began, "if you have reached this room, then you already know why the $2 mattered. It was never the amount. It was the willingness of a man with almost nothing to give back anyway." Ethan stood very still. Ranger sat beside him, shoulder touching his leg. Walter's letter continued. "The accounts, deeds, and certificates in this safe belong to the foundation Ruth and I spent our lives building. By law, I have named you trustee because you understand tools, silence, dogs, and men who pretend they are not tired. There is enough here to repair the cabin, reopen the workshop, pay staff, and keep the doors open for many years if you guard it from pride and greed. Do not let the family sell the hill. Do not let the town turn it into a plaque. Make it useful again." Ethan opened the safe. Inside were folders arranged by year, bank documents, property records, trust papers, insurance policies, and a statement from a regional bank in Burlington. The numbers were larger than anything Ethan had ever held in his life. Not flashy, not fantasy, but substantial enough to change the future of Blackwater Creek, Pine Hollow, and every veteran who might one day arrive with a service dog, an empty tank, and no words left. He sat slowly in Walter's chair, the leather creaking beneath him. The lamp cast a circle of warm light over his hands. Those hands had built bridges in uniform, patched roofs in winter, fixed engines behind barns, and held leashes through sleepless nights. They had been overlooked because they were rough, because they did not reach for attention, because they kept working after applause had moved elsewhere. Now those same hands rested on a legacy built from $2 and decades of hidden kindness. Above the desk, pinned to a corkboard, was a photograph Ethan had never seen. Walter and Ruth stood in front of the white pine on the day they planted it. Between them was a younger Ethan, perhaps 17, holding a hammer, squinting into the sun. On the back, written in Ruth's softer hand, were the words, "Someday he will know this place was always meant to find him." Ethan bowed his head, not in defeat, but in the quiet overwhelm of being seen too late and exactly on time. Ranger placed his chin on Ethan's knee. In that underground room, beneath snow, roots, and all the judgments of the world above, Ethan Caldwell finally understood what Walter had bought with $2. He had bought the first brick of a home for the forgotten, and he had saved the last key for the man who knew how it felt to be one of them. The sanctuary beneath the hill did not feel smaller after Ethan learned what it was worth. It felt larger, as if the walls had moved outward to make room for all the lives Walter and Ruth had carried in secret. Ethan stayed there until the lamps warmed the stone and the cold in his hands began to leave. He read the trust papers twice, not because he doubted them, but because each line seemed to shift the ground beneath him. Blackwater Creek cabin, surrounding parcels, restoration accounts, workshop funds, emergency housing reserve, veterinary support fund for service dogs, transportation grants, and a quiet provision for meals at Millie's Diner, all tied together with the steady legal language of a man who had known greedy hands would come looking once the hidden work became visible. Ranger lay beside Walter's desk, his black saddle rising and falling with slow breaths, his tan paws stretched toward the warmth of the lamp. Every so often, the German shepherd opened his amber eyes and watched Ethan, as if checking that the man was still there, still breathing, still willing. Near midnight, Ethan carried the most important folders back up through the passage and into the cabin. The snow had stopped. Stars scattered across the Vermont sky, cold and clean, and the creek spoke softly under its ice. Inside, he placed the folders on the table beside the $2 bill and sat until the fire became a bed of red coals. He thought about calling Mr. Halvorsen immediately, then decided morning would do. Some truths needed dawn. When light finally came, it found Ethan already awake, shaving at the small mirror above the sink with a carefulness he had not felt in months. He put on his cleanest flannel, the brown canvas jacket, and the boots he had brushed free of mud. Ranger stood near the door, alert and composed, looking less like a pet than a witness. The drive into Pine Hollow was quiet. Morning sun spread over the snowfields, touching barns, fence posts, and mailboxes with a brightness that made everything ordinary seem forgiven. At the lawyer's office, Mr. Halvorsen's secretary looked surprised to see Ethan back so soon, then more surprised when she saw the thick folder of bank documents and notarized trust papers under his arm. Mr. Halvorsen invited him in, and within 20 minutes the older lawyer's professional calm had given way to something very close to reverence. He removed his glasses, read a page again, then looked at Ethan over the desk where the family had left 2 days earlier. "This is all valid," he said softly. "Walter filed the trust years ago. He amended it 3 months before he passed. You are named sole trustee and lifetime caretaker of the Blackwater Creek property. The assets cannot be sold for private distribution. They are restricted for veteran housing, workshop operations, service dog support, and community reintegration." Ethan nodded, though the words entered him slowly. Mr. Halvorsen leaned back, eyes damp but steady. "Your uncle built a foundation and disguised it as an old cabin." Ethan looked down at Ranger, who sat quietly beside his chair. "No," he said after a moment. "He built a home and disguised it as nothing." By noon, word had begun to move through Pine Hollow, not loudly at first, but with the soft speed of small towns. Clara Whitcomb arrived at the office wearing her blue knitted cap and carrying a folder of records she had kept for 30 years in a flour tin. The diner waitress came with copies of old meal tabs Walter had paid anonymously. A retired sheriff brought a box of photographs. Men and women who had once stayed at the cabin came or called or sent messages through relatives. Each story added another board to the structure Ethan was only beginning to see. A carpenter from Rutland said Walter had given him work when nobody else trusted him to show up. A widowed nurse said Ruth had watched her children while she filled out veteran benefit forms. A truck driver from New Hampshire said he had slept in the cabin loft for 3 weeks and left with a job, a used coat, and the first peaceful morning he could remember. By late afternoon, the Caldwell family arrived. Marla came first, her cream coat buttoned tight, Brent behind her with the strained smile of a man trying to recover a game he had already lost. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Their questions carried the shine of politeness over something harder. Why had Walter never told them? Surely there had been some misunderstanding. Could Ethan really manage something this complex? Would it not be wiser to let the family help decide what happened to the land? Ethan listened without interrupting. He had listened to engines misfire, beams settle, dogs breathe through storms, men talk around grief, and relatives wrap hunger in concern. Ranger sat at his left side, ears forward, unmoving. Mr. Halvorson explained the trust. Clara explained the history. The documents explained the rest. Slowly, the room that had once measured Ethan with $2 had to face what $2 had become. Brent looked at the floor. Marla looked toward the window, where snowlight brightened the glass. Ethan felt no victory. That surprised him. He had imagined, perhaps in the small injured place he did not like to admit existed, that being proven worthy would feel like standing taller than those who had doubted him. Instead, it felt like being handed a lantern in a dark room full of people who had forgotten they were cold. He turned to Marla first. Walter did not leave this to me so I could punish anyone, he said. He left it because he wanted it used. If you want to help, help. If you want to own it, you cannot. The words were not sharp. That made them stronger. Silence settled. Clara's eyes softened. Mr. Halvorson folded his hands. Ranger leaned once against Ethan's leg, a quiet pressure that said the ground was still there. 3 weeks later, the first volunteers arrived at Blackwater Creek. Snow still lay in the shadows, but the days had begun to lengthen. Ethan repaired the porch rail with a local carpenter who had known Walter. Clara labeled file boxes at the kitchen table. Mr. Halvorson coordinated the foundation paperwork. A veterinarian from Burlington offered weekend visits for service dogs. Millie's Diner sent soup in large containers, and the waitress taped a note to the first one that read, "No explanation needed." Ethan framed the $2 bill in simple pine and hung it near the front door, not as a relic of money, but as a reminder that worth can begin too small for proud people to notice. On the first evening the cabin reopened, a young veteran arrived in a rusted sedan with a duffel bag, a service dog, and eyes that looked at the ground before they looked at any person. Ethan met him on the porch with Ranger beside him and the warm light of the cabin behind them. He did not ask for a story. He did not ask for proof of pain. He simply opened the door wider and said, "Coffee is on, and there is room by the stove." The young man stood very still, as if kindness had become a language he almost remembered. Then his dog stepped forward, Ranger touched noses with him, and the cabin seemed to breathe again. Ethan looked past the porch to the white pine by the creek, its branches moving gently in the evening wind. Somewhere beneath its roots, the sanctuary waited, not hidden anymore, but protected by purpose. Walter and Ruth had done more than leave money. They had left a way for forgotten people to be welcomed without having to earn their humanity back. And as the first new guest crossed the threshold, Ethan understood that inheritance was not always something a man received. Sometimes it was something that received him, repaired him quietly, and then taught him how to keep the door open for others. Spring did not arrive at Blackwater Creek with a grand announcement. It came softly, in the drip of snowmelt from the cabin roof, in the first brown grass showing beside the porch steps, in the smell of thawed earth rising from the creek bank, and in the way morning light stayed a little longer on the pine floor before slipping away. By April, the old log cabin no longer looked like something the world had forgotten. Its porch rails stood straight, sanded smooth by careful hands. The roof had been repaired with dark green metal that caught the sunrise. The stone chimney breathed steady smoke into the Vermont sky. A hand-carved sign hung beside the door, simple and warm, the $2 cabin. Beneath it, smaller letters read, "Welcome home, no explanation needed." Ethan had not wanted the sign to be too polished. He wanted the place to keep Walter's plainness, Ruth's tenderness, and the honest look of a home that understood weather. Each morning, he rose before 6, made coffee in the enamel pot, opened the front door for the cold air, and let Ranger step onto the porch first. The German shepherd moved more slowly in the mornings now that the hard winter had passed, but his amber eyes remained bright, his black saddle shining after brushing, his tan legs steady on the boards he had helped lead Ethan back to. Ranger would stand at the top step and listen to the creek, the road, the woods, and whatever quiet signals lived beneath ordinary sound. Ethan had learned to trust those pauses. Some men read newspapers. Ranger read the world. The foundation grew not like a business, but like a fire properly tended. Clara Whitcomb came 3 mornings a week with her blue knitted cap traded for a straw hat as the weather warmed, organizing records in the front room and teaching Ethan the names behind the numbers. Mr. Halvorson handled the legal filings and insisted on paying for his own coffee, though nobody let him. Millie's Diner sent soup every Thursday and biscuits every Sunday. A retired carpenter repaired the loft and asked for only a place to leave his tools. A veterinarian from Burlington drove down twice a month to check service dogs and the old strays that somehow began appearing near the woodpile. The sanctuary beneath the hill remained private, not secret exactly, but protected. Ethan brought people there only when the cabin above was not enough, when someone needed to see the wall of names, the flag, the workbench, the old photograph of Samson, and the words that had held Ethan himself together: "Welcome home, no explanation needed." The first young veteran who had arrived in the rusted sedan stayed for 9 days. His name was Luke Mercer. He spoke little at first, but he knew engines, and by the 3rd morning he had the cabin generator running smoother than it had in years. Ethan paid him from the workshop fund, not as charity but as work honestly done. Luke's service dog, a quiet yellow Labrador named June, learned to sleep near Ranger by the stove. On the 10th day, Luke stood on the porch with his duffel bag and a steadier look in his eyes. "I forgot I could fix things," he said. Ethan handed him a thermos for the road and thought of Walter's ledger. Sometimes a man did not need a speech. He needed a wrench, a warm meal, and someone willing to believe his hands still knew what to do. By May, 2 more veterans had come through. Then a widowed nurse. Then a truck driver who had served in the Navy and needed 3 nights of quiet before starting a new route. They left notes in a wooden box near the door, not required, not displayed, just received. "Thank you for not making me explain. I slept. My dog liked the creek. I remembered how coffee tastes when you are not afraid of the morning." Ethan read each note once, then placed it in a new ledger beside Walter's old ones. He began to understand that healing did not always feel like joy. Sometimes it felt like a room where a person could stop pretending. Sometimes it was the sound of boots on a repaired porch, the weight of a dog against a knee, the sight of an American flag folded with care but not used for decoration, the smell of pine boards warmed by the afternoon sun. One Sunday after church, Marla came alone. She parked at the end of the drive and walked slowly to the cabin in a pale blue coat, her hands empty. Ethan saw her from the porch but did not move toward her right away. Ranger stood beside him, alert but calm. Marla looked at the sign, then at the porch, then through the open door where Clara was laughing with the retired carpenter over a crooked shelf. For a while, she said nothing. The spring wind moved through the white pine by the creek, and somewhere under its roots the old sanctuary held its patient silence. Finally, Marla looked at Ethan with eyes stripped of the polished certainty she had worn in the lawyer's office. "I did not know," she said. Ethan nodded. "None of us did." She swallowed, and the simple truth of that answer seemed to make room for her shame without feeding it. "I should not have laughed," she said. Ethan looked out toward Blackwater Creek, where sunlight broke into bright pieces on the moving water. "No," he said gently. "But you can help stack firewood if you want." Marla stared at him, then gave a small, surprised laugh that trembled at the edges. She took off her gloves and spent the afternoon carrying split logs to the side porch, clumsy at first, then quieter, then almost peaceful. Ethan did not call it forgiveness. He had learned that forgiveness was not always a door flung open. Sometimes it was a porch step repaired strong enough for someone to stand on while they learned how to knock. Near sunset, Ethan walked down to the creek with Ranger. The $2 bill was framed inside the cabin now, but Ethan no longer needed to touch it to feel its weight. The bill had done its work. It had led him from insult to inheritance, from inheritance to memory, from memory to service. He stood beside Ruth's white pine, its new needles soft and bright at the tips, and watched Ranger lower his muzzle to the water. The dog drank, then lifted his head, amber eyes catching the last gold of evening. Ethan thought of Walter and Ruth planting the tree, of Clara keeping records in a flour tin, of the unnamed service member who had once paid back breakfast with all he had, of every veteran who would arrive someday believing they had become a burden and leave remembering they were still a person with gifts to offer. Behind him, the cabin windows glowed warm. Voices moved inside, gentle and ordinary. A chair scraped. Coffee poured. A dog barked once, happy and brief. Ethan rested one hand on Ranger's head and looked at the home he had almost believed was a joke. His family had overlooked him, but kindness had not. The world had priced the gift at $2, but grace had counted differently. And in the quiet between the creek and the cabin, Ethan finally understood that some miracles do not fall from the sky. Some are built by tired hands, hidden beneath old wood, guarded by loyal dogs, and kept alive by the ones who stay kind when nobody is watching.